Iconoclasm never fell out of fashion, but it has almost always been metaphorical if you wanted to find the last time monuments were destroyed to significant political effect in this country. Adding a Mohican haircut to a statue of Churchill doesn't count. You would probably have to reach back to the English Civil War. Then came 2015's Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which lit on the statue of Cecil Rhodes in the University of Cape Town as a flashpoint in a wider movement to decolonize South African education. The contagion was swift, arriving at Oriel College, Oxford, by the end of the year. The arguments have the adamantine quality of the statues themselves. Those defending statues, whether that's Donald Trump saluting the big beasts of slavery, or Chris Patton telling students to admire Cecil Rhodes for the sake of freedom of thought, do so on the basis that they are a part of history. To remove or destroy them is to deny or erase history. Those wanting to tear them down argue that it is not history that they want to erase, but a manipulated version of it, in which the villains are valorized and the victims erased. This should be relatively easy to resolve the danger. If a statue of Rhodes were removed, isn't that we will forget history. Rather, it is that we will revisit history, and ask who we actually want to memorialize. In a more relaxed age, we could perhaps agree to add some words to Rhodes' plaque: politician, adventurer, resource vulture, white supremacist, while choosing someone more pro-social for the next statue. However, it probably would have come up. Iconoclasm is, above anything, an attempt to bring to a head a debate that is operating at a subcuticular level. Colonialism, good or bad, slavery, good or bad, these questions are boiling under, like suppurating sores, poisoning issues from Brexit in the UK to police racism in the US. Coming out trenchantly against a long-dead enemy is one way of forcing the confrontation to the surface. Statue crushing is not something that happens in an era of consensus. If the violence that resulted in Charlottesville, Virginia, last month, when white supremacists marched against plans to remove a statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee under the gaze of a statue of Thomas Jefferson, wasn't surprising, the extent of it, the tragic death of civil rights activist Heather Heyer and the injury of 19 others, was. So was the chillingly neutral statement made afterwards by the police. The white supremacist marchers were simply better armed than they were. But various statue actions across the US have held another surprise. When you pull down a Confederate monument, they come down with a tiny tug, then crumple like a paperclip, according to Jack Smith, IV of the online magazine Mike. These Confederate statues aren't carved marble, they are cheap bronze casts, and they went up not straight after the Civil War, but in two waves, one at the turn of the 20th century, one in the 1960s, coinciding both times with a growing civil rights movement. The sponsors, the Daughters of the Confederacy, standing $200 statues for towns with the will to memorialize the glorious old days, but not the means, and not a historical record of Robert E. Lee standing among his peers. They are a propaganda history grab many years after, undertaken on the principle that if you shape the past, you own the present. Very lavish sculptures, intricately carved in marble or stone, have their own peculiar insult, of course, the ownership of history by the richest. Yet incredibly cheap, tinny monuments with Daughters of the Confederacy stamped on them like a Primark label are pretty vexing, too. If you are going to appropriate history, it should at least cost you. Statues, in real life, offer nothing to the historian of the man himself. Oh, yeah, it's always a man, unless it's a horse, or, as one of the readers who nominated the statues below has pointed out, a naked unnamed nymph, but they do offer a pretty solid account to the nation of what it should be proud of. Trying to upend the blood-drenched narrative has, so far, spilled more blood. It seems that you can only tell a new story by erecting new statues. Zoe Williams, Mary Wollstonecraft by Jess Phillips, MP Mary Wollstonecraft 175,997 by John Opie. Photograph Alumni Mary Wollstonecraft, who was born in 1759, was the original suffragette and the first feminist. She was a woman so extraordinarily ahead of her time that if she were here today, writing the same things, living the same life, she would still be considered a radical. A woman from a bleak background, who gave birth to a child out of wedlock, she dragged herself up to be an independent best-selling author on human rights and gender issues. I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves, she wrote, in a vindication of the rights of woman, as well as arguing that women were capable of reason but merely lacked education. She was right, of course, but feminists the world over are still making the very same argument and receiving the very same response: aggressive trolling by people with louder voices. Wollstonecraft did not just write about independent women, she lived as one and was derided both then and after her death by those whose power she threatened. So dangerous were her views to the establishment that her voice had to be delegitimized. Horace Walpole wrote of her that she was a hyena in petticoats. A statue to Wollstonecraft would be two fingers up to the naysayers of the time and to the modern-day descendants who spew anti-woman bile across the world. If it were up to me, I would have her standing in her Stoke Newington community in North London, resplendent in petticoats, with hyenas at her feet and a wry, knowing smile on her face. An up yours to the world and a beautiful testament, a thank you from all the women who, for the past 250 years, have picked up her kick-ass mantle. Reader's nomination. It's obvious, incredible, there is no statue of the founder of feminism anywhere. And a statue that depicts her life like, please. In Trafalgar Square, a very courageous, innovative, cogent, passionate, hard-working and creative woman whose reputation was damaged for a century by her loving but bumbling widower. All of us fortunate women in the West are in her debt 1,000-fold. Angela Smith, 66, London. David Attenborough, B.K. Tumble. David Attenborough, still going strong in his 90s. Photograph. Sarah Dunn, BBC. If legacy is a requisite for a statue, then there can be no argument when it comes to David Attenborough. His achievements as a broadcaster and naturalist are without parallel. For more than 60 years he has been the nation's guide to our planet and its natural wonders. Generations of us have traveled vicariously with him to the tops of mountains, the bottoms of oceans, to deserts, rainforests and the icy expanses of the poles. We have crawled into caves, climbed trees, burrowed into termite mounds, scrabbled under hedges. We have been shown that even in the most inhospitable of places, as well as right on our own doorsteps, there is life everywhere on Earth. And once Attenborough has helped us make the discovery, there is no need for hyperbole, for a stream of trump-card statistics, because he knows the natural world can speak for itself. He knows it can leave you speechless, breathlessly with delight, and he allows us that moment, so that when he goes on to explain that every living thing, from the vast to the tiny, from the magnificent to the nondescript, has a role, a purpose, we don't simply understand why that is important, we care. And by opening our eyes and making us care, Attenborough has been able to educate and inspire and influence people of all ages and all backgrounds. There are, and will be for a long time to come, scientists, conservationists, naturalists, and broadcasters who will cite Attenborough as the role model, who will take up his baton and ensure that for future generations there will still be life on Earth. Reader's nomination. Sir David Attenborough's statue should display him with a gorilla on his lap, as immortalized in Life on Earth so many years ago, the moment that turned him from a nature presenter into a legend beloved in every home in Britain. Gorilla Dave should then be located directly outside the Houses of Parliament to remind people that while politicians bicker and spat hot air inside, the world around us is bigger than them and the petty differences, and we should all look after it. Jane Nelson, 45, London. Ada Lovelace, B. Conrad Shawcross. Augusta Ada, Countess Lovelace, 18,151,852 by Margaret Carpenter. Photograph. Universal Images Group. Getty Images. I first came across Ada Lovelace in 1999, when I was a student and read a book called Zeros and Ones by Sadie Plant, a very rich, poetic take on the life of this extraordinary figure and her collaboration with the inventor Charles Babbage. It opens with a scene that is embedded in my psyche. In 1833, a young girl came across a machine that would change her life and the world forever. That machine was the difference engine. Since then I have returned to her time and time again. Her life and work are a constant source of inspiration. Lovelace is a controversial figure, historically, socially, conceptually, mathematically. While Babbage saw his machine as a calculator, she glimpsed that it could do more than simply crunch numbers, and in one set of notes she speculates on the possibility of the machine being capable of producing music. Computer historian Doran Swade sums this up very succinctly because of her speculations. She is perhaps the first person to see that numbers could be more than just a quantity but an entity, i.e., they are not just for counting apples, bananas and sheep, but could represent images and music themselves. This was the first glimpse of data and code. Her insight led to an artwork of mine, in which a series of female innovators respond to a machine and release its potential. It is called the Ada Project. Babbage and Lovelace were not allowed to show the machine in the Great Exhibition of 1851, but had the difference engine been there it would have been as important, in terms of its implications, as the locomotive. Lovelace died the following year, aged 33, a painful early death. Her doctors diagnosed hysteria brought on by the study of mathematics. It was, in fact, ovarian cancer. The idea of a monument to her is an incredible one, and important too. I would certainly relish the challenge. Reader's nomination. Not only was Ada Lovelace the first female computer scientist, she was the first computer scientist. She was the daughter of Lord Byron. Her mother, fearing that she would be a poet like her father, pushed her towards mathematics instead. Our digital era owes a great deal to women such as Lovelace, not to mention the Americans Grace Hopper and Margaret Hamilton, as well as Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson. Lovelace would have been my first pick for the new £10 note over Jane Austen. I think it is particularly important in this day and age to show that women can and should be studying STEM subjects. There is a historical precedent for it. Ruth W. 21, Aberdeen, Victoria Wood by Lucy Mangan, Victoria Wood in 2003. Photograph Donald McLachlan. Getty Images. In India, if a man dies, the woman throws herself onto the funeral pyre. If a man dies in this country, the woman just drags herself into the kitchen and says 72 Baps, Connie. You slice, ill spread. And there we are, the British, as seen by Victoria Wood, in all the defining emotional and linguistic parsimony. She saw the best, worst and every nuance in between in us, beamed them through the prism of her talent, and the results prostrated us with laughter at the glory, absurdity and bleakness of our national way of life. How can we not publicly recognize a woman who Sir recognized us plans to put up a statue of her in her hometown of Bury, possibly in character as Bren from Dinner Ladies, have stalled, but it is hard to imagine that there won't be one somewhere in the north. I never marched from Jarrow, but those men's feet ache in my heart, as Jim Broadbent, playing the professionally boreal author Wood encounters at a party, puts it, shortly before revealing that he lives in Chiswick. She moved down south 15 years before she died, but all of her sensibility and every one of her cadences were, and will be forever, northern. Anywhere in Manchester would do. Wood also loved Morecambe, but that already has Graham Ibison's statue of Eric, and she deserves her own unadulterated space. We could put it somewhere that would mean something to fans, and detonate the cascade of shared memories, quotes and laughter that is the best part of revering Wood. It could be in Urmston, Kirkcudbright, the left bank of the Blink and Limpopo, or somewhere bizarre. Where was it? Oh, yes, Doncaster. And it should be of the young Victoria, with a chiffon scarf round her neck with her bronze life-saving medal attached to it, kicking the bottom of a bus stop and an inscription that reads, well, actually, Dennis Beasley, my auntie knows Simon D. So na. Reader's nomination. Victoria Wood. End of. Anonymous. Leamington Spa. Brian Hoare by Mark Rylance. Brian Hoare in 2006. Photograph Peter McDermott. Images. Brian Hoare was a peace activist who stood opposite the Houses of Parliament for 10 years, 24 hours a day, to remind all of the politicians of the consequences of Britain's disastrous foreign policy in the Middle East. There is probably no one else nominated who was literally a human statue. He was kicked in the head by strangers at night time and sworn at all day long by passers-by. Eventually, he used crutches to help him stand, and his physicality came to represent the perseverance, endurance and dedication of the peace movement in Britain. He represented centuries of proud resistance to imperialism. A statue of Hoare would be a great way to remind politicians that, although the anti-imperialists are in the minority, they have been here for a long time. I certainly hope that their utopian visions of England's relationship to the rest of the world will come to pass, and when that day comes, it would be great if the young people could look back and see figures such as Brian Hoare. Sculptor Amanda Ward has already created a maquette which pretty much sums up how a statue could look. She has captured Hoare very well. If I was playing him in a play, that would be the expressive mold. Even though he cannot support himself on two legs anymore, he is still there, standing. The most obvious place for him to stand would be in Parliament Square, but he could also stand outside the Imperial War Museum. The statue could include some of the extraordinary banners and artifacts surrounding him, as well as all the badges on his hat and a megaphone in his hand. The maquette is a small-scale model of a sculpture, but I wouldn't mind if it was this size because he is representative of the small man, the powerless man. Whether you agreed with him or not, there is something about his refusal to move that warrants a statue. Reader's nomination in Parliament Square, to commemorate the man and continue the protest to remind those in the Houses of Parliament that having courage of our convictions is essential, a permanent reminder of a man we should aspire to. Mike Swannock, 38, Nottingham. Dada by Nauroji by Tulip Sadiq MP, Indian statesman. Dada by Nauroji, 1825-1917, C1870. Photograph Hulton Archive. Getty Images. Dada by Nauroji is remembered for being the first Asian Member of Parliament elected to the House of Commons, but he was much more. Known to many as the Grand Old Man of India, he was also a leading academic, the founder of the first Indian company to be established in Britain, and an avid campaigner for minority rights. Later in life, he would mentor Mahatma Gandhi, having served for 3 terms as President of the Indian National Congress. Nauroji's pursuit of an egalitarian society arrived at a time when prime ministers had failed to grant minority rights, and were actively derisory about them. His parliamentary legacy and wider achievements in both industry and academia stand as an obvious rebuke to the then Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, who stated that Britain was not ready to elect a black man. If he is honoured with a statue, it should be in his former London constituency of Finsbury. Although he is currently honoured by a plaque at the Town Hall, and a statue in Mumbai, his legacy surely warrants greater recognition in the UK. London is home to hundreds of thousands of first, second, third and now fourth-generation immigrants from the subcontinent. A statue for Nauroji would be a fitting testament to a man who paved the way for British Asians to thrive. As our country attempts to forge a global Britain post-Brexit, a statue of this excellent parliamentarian would be a welcome reminder of our reciprocal duties of care to the countries and people we hope to trade with on an ever greater scale. Reader's nomination. With a rise in racism, in hatred between races and religions, in acid and terror attacks, there needs to be some symbol of hope and unity, to show that things changed for the good and that Britain can work in harmony, no matter what your background. Anonymous. Gina Miller by Nezreen Malik. Gina Miller. Photograph Chris J. Ratcliffe. Getty Images. While people were trying to turn Theresa May into a new Iron Lady, another far more legitimate Iron Lady was being maligned, abused and even sent death threats. It is one of the many strange dislocations of Brexit that May, a woman who has changed her mind about almost all the big decisions in her political life, was the subject of a feverish rebranding campaign as someone who was strong and stable, while Gina Miller, someone who has stood by her convictions, was seen as a traitor. And Miller's convictions are not as simple as merely wanting to see Brexit reversed. That is a willful misreading of her position. She cares about democracy, not the populist posturing kind that hides behind empty phrases such as the will of the people in order to abdicate responsibility, but the real kind. The sort of democracy that ensures that the mechanisms of government are empowered to properly further the interests of the voters, rather than be a crude club for them. A democracy that reminds us that politicians are our representatives, not our delegates. We have heard a lot about British values since the EU referendum. I'm still not sure what British values Brexit represents, apart from misplaced nostalgia. If Brexit's British values are meant to include independence from groupthink and a dignified self-assurance in the face of a mob, then no one embodies them more than Miller. Give her a statue, wrought of iron, and erected at the steps of the High Court of Justice. Reader's nomination. Courageously looking forward, with howling mobs urged on by cynical reactionaries collapsing behind her. It's probably counterproductive to erect one now, but I hope the time will come when we return to our senses and she gets one. Anonymous. Norfolk. Zaha Hadid by Hans Ulrich Obrist. Zaha Hadid in 2013. Photograph David Levine for The Guardian. Zaha Hadid was a pioneering architect and artist who created a totally unique language, and I have no doubt that her work will be remembered for decades and centuries to come. She also had immense courage, determination and energy, and completely changed what was previously a male-dominated profession. At the Serpentine Gallery, we were honored to have collaborated with her on many projects. She was a trustee of the gallery, she designed the Serpentine Sackler, and we held an exhibition of her early works just after her death, the final project we planned together during her lifetime. I think one of the things that makes her work resonate is her experimentation. Hadid said there should be no end to experimentation, and that's our mantra, too. Monuments don't usually tend to move, but a statue commemorating her would need to reflect her spirit of dynamism and the weightless quality of her buildings. It couldn't be static. Reader's nomination. Hadid made significant contributions to society with her magnificent and unique structures and should be recognized and celebrated for her creativity and intelligence, her fortitude and individuality. She was also a pioneer in architecture, breaking stereotypical roles and setting a new precedent for women to move into the field and excel. Rachel Reader, 48, Worthing David Bowie by Alexis Petridis. David Bowie in 1976. Photograph Gisberhan Krutreidfans. There is, of course, already a statue of David Bowie, or at least a prototype. The real, Kickstarter-funded thing is set to be unveiled in Aylesbury's Market Square next March, the latest of umpteen pieces of public art to have sprung up in the wake of Bowie's death. It is not difficult to understand why people want to see him commemorated. Quite aside from his artistic legacy and incalculable influence on music and fashion, there is a sense that Bowie had a genuine positive social impact on Britain. It wasn't just young gay fans who felt energized and emboldened by his emergence in full Ziggy drag in 1972, although it is hard to overestimate his impact upon them. In one nonchalant move, he made homosexuality seem daring and colorful rather than shameful, wrote Martin Aston in his History of LGBTQ pop, breaking down the walls of heartache but also on a vast swath of previously marginalized misfits. No matter how weird and alien you felt, you couldn't be as weird and alien as Bowie and his band looked. Indeed, you could argue that Bowie represented Britain as we would like it to be seen: inclusive, eccentric, innovative, always moving forward and changing. Reader's nomination. The only celebrity death I cried tears for. A true creative spirit, born of a Britain I could relate to. And because many others feel that way, too. He was the best of being British, a creative pioneer from modest beginnings who couldn't help being globally respected as a force of nature. Put it in Beckenham, where it really started to take off for him. Steph Avery Reynolds, 52, Kenned Peter Tatchell by Chris Bryant MP. Peter Tatchell in 2013. Photograph Felix Clay. There's something deeply irritating about Peter Tatchell, and that's the beauty of him. His sea-green incorruptibility gets under the skin. He has a single-mindedness of purpose, which makes you know that he will never compromise with prejudice and injustice, so you might as well get on and recognize that he is right. When he tried to perform a citizen's arrest on Robert Mugabe for his human rights abuses, even the Daily Mail had to admit a smidgen of respect. The change in attitudes to homosexuality has been so sudden in this country that it is difficult to remember the courage Tatchell showed when AIDS provoked irrational paranoia about gay men, and when Thatcher brought in Section 28 banning teachers from portraying gay relationships in a positive light. Yes, there were out actors and singers, but gay politicians bore the full brunt of vitriol from the hypocritically prurient and judgmental British press. Anyone who dared to suggest that homosexuals should be treated equally under the law was derided as dangerously immoral, branded as a member of the loony left, and hounded out of office. Tatchell knows this better than any. He was defeated as the Labour candidate in the Bermondsey by-election in 1981 thanks to a hateful campaign by the Liberals, whose leaflets referred to a straight choice. He was assaulted by neo-Nazi thugs for campaigning for LGBT rights in Russia. Tatchell's courage has been vindicated. We now have an equal age of consent, same-sex marriage, gay adoption, and anti-discrimination laws. The politicians who brought in those changes, Blair, Brown and Cameron, would not be his heroes, but even they would admit they owe him a debt of gratitude. Reader's nomination. He should be placed at the top of Nelson's column in place of Nelson. Tatchell's column would depict Peter outing hypocritical bishops or attempting a citizen's arrest on Mugabe. Colin McKillip, 50, Glasgow. Doreen Lawrence by Hugh Muir. Doreen Lawrence, Indiana, 2013, at the 20th anniversary memorial for her son, Stephen. Photograph Sarah Lee for The Guardian. The life of multicultural Britain can be divided into two distinct periods: BL and AL, or before Lawrence and after Lawrence. In the BL period, before, that is, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, Indiana, 1993, minority Britons would proclaim that they perennially received unfair treatment from the authorities. The standard response was that the complaints were overblown and that the real issue was too many chips on shoulders. Then came the Macpherson Report, the culmination of the Lawrence family's campaign to expose the racism, indolence and institutional hostility that led to Stephen's murder and the Met's failure to catch his killers. Suddenly there was the evidence for all to see, not just of the attitudes and failures in Stephen's case, but of the mindset that underpinned widespread discrimination in Britain. The problem hasn't gone away, but in the Al era, we no longer deny the problem exists. Doreen Lawrence, now a peer, now a tireless community leader, dragged us to that new reality. A statue is the least she deserves. Reader's nomination. She has been an incredibly eloquent voice for race relations, social change and justice in the UK. She turned the most awful thing a mother can experience into a crusade for good. Her strength of character and the way she has conducted her life has made her an icon for us to try to emulate. I think her statue deserves to be in the most visible of places in London, maybe outside the new Metropolitan Police HQ. Jonathan Dannett, 59, Stoke-on-Trent. Stuart Hall by Isaac Julian Stuart Hall. Photograph Eamon McCabe for The Guardian. Stuart Hall was very influential in Britain. He established a discipline, cultural studies, and a journal, the New Left Review. He was very involved with the inauguration of Channel 4, arguing for access, and that too many voices were excluded from the main bastions of British broadcasting. He was part of the establishment of the Black Arts Cultural Centre in Rivington Place, East London, and involved in important inquiries into policing. He was a theorist as well, a figure respected in the academies, who also did much work outside of the academy, to build the cultural mix we take for granted in Britain today. In my film Frantz Fanon Black Skin, White Mask, Hall takes Fanon's ideas about depersonalization and translates them for a contemporary audience. He was very sophisticated at that, explaining questions around racism so that everyone could understand. But I wouldn't want to confine his works to race, because he was also a spokesman for the cultural left in this country. His ideas were prophetic. In the early 90s, he was already talking about questions of identity, production, violence, terrorism, how the media creates moral panics, and how migration is used as a red herring, especially in times of political crisis. All are relevant to Brexit. I think he would be rather horrified by a statue of himself, because he was very much about his ideas and keeping them alive. His books, his writings, the Stuart Hall Foundation, those are always in which we might want to memorialize his legacy. Reader's nomination because of his graceful and searing analysis of arriving in the UK as a migrant. His massive contribution to education and social thinking on race and politics and British blind spots. The statue should be of a young man looking toward the UK and an old man looking away. Place it on the cliffs of Dover. Make it of iron and steel and make sure he is standing on books. Steffi, 56, Sydney and Liverpool. J.K. Rowling by Jonathan Friedland. J.K. Rowling in 2012. Photograph David Levinson. Getty Images. When Danny Boyle outed himself to The Guardian in 2013 as a Republican, the filmmaker had a suggestion for who might replace the monarch as head of state. Why, it was J.K. Rowling, of course, she who had done such a majestic turn in Boyle's 2012 opening ceremony for the London Olympics. After all, Rowling had to her name a mammoth achievement, a series of novels that had found global success, winning over a generation of children to the joys of reading and whose characters had secured a place in the national imagination. She was also a serious philanthropist, funding action for orphans, for single parents and for those living with Ms. And she was that rare billionaire who paid all her taxes. All that might not be enough to have earned Rowling the throne, but it surely entitles her to a statue. She embodies the admirable virtues of determination, creativity, and generosity, all of which deserve public celebration. As for its location, I am with the anonymous reader below. The Scottish capital is where, as a single mother living on benefits, Rowling wrote the Potter novels, but it is also the home of the Anne Rowling Regenerative Neurology Clinic, the MS Centre, established with the help of a £10 million donation from the author and named after her mother, who died from the disease aged 45. There is one more reason why Rowling is the ideal candidate for a major public landmark. On Twitter, she has become a fierce opponent of Brexit, of Donald Trump and of Scottish nationalism. Which means any statue of her would be controversial. And what's a new statue without a big old bro? Reader's nomination. I think it should be her holding a book and a child's hand, in Princes Street Gardens in Edinburgh, the city where she read her books, and the location of the MS research facility she funded. Obviously, her books are good, but the fact that she has made a point of paying all her taxes when so few people earning as much of her do, I think is something worth praising. It is a shame that someone paying the taxes should be praiseworthy, but sadly it is. Anonymous Joe Cox by Patrick Winter. Joe Cox in 2014. Photograph DDP USRX Shutterstock. There is something paradoxical about a statue to celebrate the life of Joe Cox. She was so dynamic, energetic, and even restless that she would never allow herself to be imprisoned by the fixed shapes carved by a stonemason. Somehow, any memorial would need to be a cinematic statue to convey her true determination and spirit. She would also have laughed at the idea of the reverence implicit in a dusty statue. She cared passionately about the issues that animated her, and the people she sought to help, but she never set herself on a pedestal, let alone a plinth, or apart from anyone. She would have laughed herself to pieces at the idea. The whole basis of her political work was cooperation, to break down divisions in communities, at Westminster and even between nations. That meant searching for the best in everyone, drawing it out, listening and looking for a human language to create shared ground. Most responded to that humanity. It did not make her views bland, or anodyne mush. Her views on humanitarian intervention in Syria, such as UN aid drops, took her to difficult places that would make the current Labour leadership uneasy. Politicians' equivocations over Brexit would have frustrated her. Her politics were led by values, not tribes. At a time when forces of hate and division have been unleashed, she stood for cooperation, and in the end cooperation is the prerequisite for a successful democracy. She was a modern Democrat, and for that reason she was killed, and for that reason she requires our memorial. Reader's nomination. It's crucial that we keep the memory of Jo alive, and ensure remembrance of the dreadful enabling of bigotry that led to her death. I would suggest it should be in her constituency. I would like it to depict something of her openness, her commitment to social justice, and perhaps with the quotation, "We have more in common than that which divides us." And surely it must have that smile. Alice B. 68, Alston Moor, Cumbria. Francis Bacon by Jonathan Jones. Francis Bacon in 1980. Photograph Jane Bone for The Guardian. What might a statue of the painter Francis Bacon look like? If the idea is to honor him, it could scarcely be a simple, realistic bronze figure. Bacon tore the human figure apart. His meaty existential vision of a godless world is spattered with blood, semen and feces in paintings of lovers wrestling, popes in glass prisons and flesh that looks bomb-damaged. A statue of him should be similarly brutal. Fortunately, there is an obvious candidate. His admirer Damien Hirst would surely love to put up a disemboweled bronze colossus near Bacon's old Soho hangouts. Whether Bacon would have wanted such an honor is another question. He was not the kind of artist who flaunts a positive contribution to society. His art is utterly preoccupied with personal obsessions, including Nazi regalia, and gleefully elitist in its painterly passion for the grandeur of Baroque art. His ghost would almost certainly urinate on such a statue, probably not even aggressively, just when blind drunk. This is why, if anyone should have a statue, it is Bacon. There are too many celebrations of the virtuous. Bacon was the kind of subversive reprobate we should remember. Or is he to be honored as a gay man who painted explicitly years before the 1967 Sexual Offences Act that makes him sound like the soft-scented Bacon played by Steve Pemberton in the TV comedy Toast of London? The joke is that Pemberton plays Bacon as a nice, positive man, whereas his art and biographical legends suggest the opposite. Bacon is not someone to sentimentalize. It would be an insult to his tragic art. A statue of him should be as grotesque and troubling as the man himself. Reader's nomination. He certainly warrants a statue, and it must be in his old stamping ground of Soho. Bob Smalls, 50, London.